Welcome to this explainer. Grab your mental popcorn, because today we are diving into a genuinely fascinating psychological phenomenon, writing yourself as the absolute hero of your own life. It's a deeply human cognitive quirk, sitting right at the crossroads of psychology, modern culture, and our fundamental built-in need for meaning.
Let's think about this for a second. Do you ever imagine a cinematic soundtrack playing while you walk down the street? Even if that soundtrack is literally just you blasting a slightly too dramatic Spotify playlist on your morning commute? Or maybe you've caught yourself staring out a rainy window, picturing this poetic, moody voiceover narrating your deepest thoughts. Look, we've all been there. These are super relatable, everyday experiences of self-romanticization. But today we're actually going to connect those fun little daydreams to a very real, deeply rooted academic concept, the phenomenon known all over the internet as main character syndrome.
Here is how our story is going to unfold today. First, we'll meet the original main character. Then, we'll clearly define the syndrome, look at the protective power of delusions, explore the actual benefits of the spotlight, warn you against the dark side of stardom, and finally, we'll talk about how to embrace the supporting role.
Okay, Section 1, the first main character. We're going to kick things off by grounding the super modern internet trend in a classic historical archetype. Because hey, TikTok might have coined the catchy phrase, but the psychology behind it, that is centuries old.
To really get this, we have to look back at the legendary figure of Don Quixote, or as a really fascinating clinical analysis from NYU calls him, Patient Quixano. So back in 1605, Quixano's whole knights-errant fantasy was pretty much just met with ridicule. People thought it was hilarious, just impossible nonsense. But if we look at it through a modern psychiatric lens, those schizophrenia-like delusions are viewed totally differently. They're actually seen as a vital coping mechanism. Quixano was a guy who was desperate for purpose, respect, and honor in an otherwise completely mundane world. His madness was actually this brilliant protective psychological shield against profound boredom and dissatisfaction.
In fact, when his clinician really pushed him to explain why he assumed the role of a knight, patient Quixano simply said, "What else would I be?" I mean, wow. That is a profound realization, right? His self-appointed role wasn't just some random whim. It was entirely necessary for his survival and his identity, because wanting a purpose and doing absolutely anything to achieve it was way more respectable for the heroic Don Quixote than it ever could be for just the ordinary guy Alonso Quixano.
Moving on to Section 2, defining main character syndrome. Let's fast forward to the modern day to see how this builds into our current understanding of the self. Like, why do we, exactly like Quixano, still crave that protagonist energy today?
Well, psychologically speaking, main character syndrome is rooted in concepts we develop when we're just kids. Jean Piaget called it ego-centrism, which is basically where we view the entire world purely through our own perspective. And later on, psychologist David Elkind identified what he called the imaginary audience, that incredibly stressful teenage belief that everyone is constantly watching and judging you. Now, as we grow into adults, this whole thing evolves into what psychologist Dan McAdams calls our narrative identity. This is essentially a totally natural psychological process of constructing a coherent story. It's what gives our lives meaning, direction, and a sense of self. We are literally hardwired to reframe everyday, mundane events into meaningful moments.
It's kind of beautiful when you think about it, because it captures the absolute core of the human condition. We crave to feel special in a world that often feels overwhelmingly ordinary. And, as you can probably guess, social media has basically poured gasoline on this natural cognitive process. It pushes us to curate our lives, visually and narratively. In a totally chaotic world where we feel like we have zero control, turning our lives into a highly curated, cinematic highlight reel is honestly a creative and sometimes absolutely necessary response to the heavy pressure of just existing.
Which brings us to Section 3, the protection of delusions. Let's take a step deeper here. We really need to explore the biological and psychological utility of these mildly unrealistic positive illusions. Why exactly does our brain actively let us pretend? To answer that, look at a phenomenon known as reverse Othello syndrome. This is where a person holds a deeply delusional belief that their partner is completely faithful despite having overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The person who discovered this syndrome described it so powerfully. They called it an active attempt to confirm meaning on otherwise catastrophic loss or emptiness. That is huge. It completely demonstrates the immense emotional weight and the protective power of our psychological buffers. Sometimes, casting ourselves in a very specific narrative is literally the only way to buffer our minds from a truth that's just too unbearable to face.
Philosophers and psychologists actually refer to this as the shear pin theory. So in mechanics, a shear pin is this tiny little part that is intentionally designed to break in order to protect the rest of the engine from totally catastrophic failure. Well, psychologically, adopting a slightly delusional main character narrative acts the exact same way. It's this brilliant madness as strategy perspective. It shows us that casting ourselves as heroes can actually anchor us. It provides a real sense of meaning and control when reality just becomes way too chaotic or painful to handle.
All right, Section 4, Benefits of the Spotlight. So we know this mindset protects us, but does it actually help us thrive? Let's highlight the measurable, data-driven advantages of embracing that main character energy. When we look at the data, you can see a really stark contrast. There was a recent study out of a Midwestern university published in the Journal of Research and Personality, and it looked at exactly how people perceive their roles in their own life stories. The numbers are super clear. Individuals who view themselves as the major character, basically the agentic driving force in their lives, experience high levels of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Essentially, their basic psychological needs are being met, which leads to a significantly increased sense of overall well-being. But on the flip side, those who cast themselves as minor characters feel like their needs are thwarted, and that leads directly to diminished well-being. The takeaway from all this is honestly incredibly validating. Mildly unrealistic positive illusions actually build resilience. When you approach it with balance, deciding to be the main character isn't just some silly internet fad. It's a highly creative, emotionally intelligent way to navigate our lives with real purpose. It helps us pursue goals that actually mean something to us, and it gives us the agency to make our own decisions, rather than just feeling swept away by external forces.
But, Section 5, the dark side of stardom. Every spotlight casts a shadow, right? We have to pivot here to clearly separate the healthy psychological benefits from the isolating and sometimes deeply toxic dangers of this trend. The absolutely crucial point is understanding exactly where the line gets drawn. Healthy main character energy focuses on the self in a really productive way. We're talking about practicing self-care, setting firm boundaries, and genuinely improving your confidence and motivation. But when this narrative identity goes completely unchecked, it can easily cross into traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder. And that looks like grandiosity, a distinct lack of empathy, treating your friends and family like they're just disposable background extras, and demanding constant, endless external validation.
Let's do a quick reality check and honestly evaluate our own behavior for a second. You might be slipping into a bit of a diva complex if you constantly find yourself romanticizing genuine problems just for the drama of it all, instead of actually doing the hard work to grow. Or maybe you refuse to share the conversational stage, literally just waiting for others to stop talking so you can deliver your next big monologue. But honestly, the worst of it is when you start viewing other people's totally normal, differing agendas as personal attacks on your storyline. That is exactly where the empowerment of being the main character turns into a really isolating trap.
So, Section 6, embracing the supporting role. To avoid that trap entirely, we need a resolution. We need to guide ourselves toward an actionable mindset that successfully balances that healthy autonomy we talked about with vital, genuine human connection. And this brings us to a beautiful, incredibly grounding concept known as Sonder. Sonder is this profound, almost overwhelming realization that every single random passerby you see on the street has a life that is as vivid and wonderfully complex as your own. They have their own ambitions, their own inside jokes with friends, mundane daily routines, and deep, keeping them up at night worries. Really understanding Sonder encourages a huge shift in our brains. We move from this exhausting solo performance to being part of a true egalitarian ensemble. It's the realization that you are just a supporting character in millions of other people's stories, and honestly, there is an incredible relief in that.
So how do we practice this? Well, we can embrace what's called the smallness practice. Step 1, know when to be a guest star in someone else's scene. Just let them have the spotlight for a bit. Step 2, do a quick impact check. Look outward to gauge how your main character behavior is actually impacting the very real people around you. And step 3, dissolve the ego by experiencing awe. Go stand under a starlit sky or stare out at the ocean. Realize that the true wonder isn't that you are the star of the show, but that the world is incredibly vast and you get the absolute privilege to simply participate in it.
We are constantly told by society that finding ourselves is the ultimate goal in life. But maybe the true wonder is actually found in losing ourselves in the intricate web of the supporting cast.
The goal shifts from, how does this serve my storyline, to something so much more connective. So as you go about the rest of your day, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Instead of constantly performing your life, how will you choose to belong to this moment?